I never imagined that the happiest moment of my life would become the beginning of my worst nightmare. 3 months ago, I died alone in a hospital bed, my hand reaching out for a husband who hadn't been there in 20 years. But when I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in that cold hospital room. I was 25 years old, standing in my childhood bedroom, staring at the pregnancy test in my hand that showed 2 pink lines. Except this time I knew exactly what would happen next. This time I knew that the moment I told my husband about this baby, he would disappear with his first love and leave me to raise our child alone for 2 decades. This time I wasn't going to let that happen. My name is Maya Chan, and I'm about to tell you how dying and coming back to life taught me that some love stories aren't meant to have happy endings, and how the second chance I thought I wanted became the opportunity to rewrite my entire future. The pregnancy test felt heavy in my hand, even though it weighed almost nothing. I was standing in the bathroom of my small apartment, the same apartment where, in my previous life, I'd stood in this exact spot 23 years ago, holding this same test, feeling this same mixture of joy and terror. But back then I didn't know what I know now. Back then I thought Daniel Zhang loved me enough to stay. Back then, I believed our marriage vows meant something more than words spoken in front of witnesses who would later say they always knew he'd leave me. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I was 25 years old again, my face unlined by the stress and heartbreak that would come. My hair was still thick and dark, not streaked with the premature gray that raising a child alone would bring. My eyes were bright with hope instead of dulled by decades of single parenthood and financial struggle. I looked like someone who still believed in fairy tales, someone who thought love conquered all, someone who had no idea that in approximately 72 hours, her husband would pack a bag and walk out the door, following his college sweetheart to another city and leaving behind nothing but a note and 20 years of silence. But I knew. I knew because I'd lived it once already. I knew because I'd spent 2 decades working 3 jobs to raise our daughter Emma alone. I knew because I died without ever getting closure, without ever understanding why Daniel had chosen his first love over his wife and unborn child. And I knew because somehow impossibly I'd been given a chance to change everything. The date was March 15, 2003. In my original timeline, this was the day I told Daniel about the pregnancy. This was the day he'd held me and promised we'd figure it out together. This was the day he'd kissed my forehead and told me he loved me and that everything would be okay. And it was also exactly 3 days before he would disappear from my life completely, leaving me with a 4-week-old fetus and a mortgage I couldn't afford on my junior accountant's salary. I put the pregnancy test in my pocket and walked out of the bathroom. Daniel was in the kitchen making coffee, humming the same song he'd been humming that morning 23 years ago. He looked so young, so innocent, so completely unaware that in 3 days he would make a choice that would destroy our family before it even began. He was 27 years old, working as a software engineer at a startup that was about to go public. He was handsome in an understated way, with black-rimmed glasses that made him look intellectual and a smile that had convinced me he was different from all the other men I'd dated. "Morning," he said, looking up when I entered. "Want some coffee?" In my previous life I'd said no, explaining that I was trying to cut back on caffeine. That had been the opening, the moment that led to the conversation about why I was suddenly so health-conscious, which led to me showing him the test, which led to 3 days of him pretending everything was fine while secretly making plans to leave me. "Sure," I said this time. "I'd love some." He looked surprised but poured me a cup. I watched him move around our small kitchen, noting details I'd forgotten over the decades. The way he always tapped the coffee pot 3 times before pouring. The small scar on his left hand from a cooking accident years before we met. The way he smiled to himself when he thought no one was looking, like he had a secret that made him happy. I realized now that he probably did have a secret. Her name was Lily Wong, and she'd been his girlfriend all through college before they'd broken up in their senior year. I'd known about her, of course. Daniel had been open about having a serious relationship before me. What I hadn't known, what I would discover much later, was that Lily had never really left his life. They'd stayed in touch. They'd met for coffee occasionally. They'd convinced themselves they were just friends. Right up until the moment she called him and told him she was moving to Seattle for a job opportunity, and asked if he wanted to come with her. And he'd said yes. He'd chosen a maybe with his ex-girlfriend over a definite with his wife and child. "You okay?" Daniel asked, noticing I'd been staring at him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at how accurate that was. I'm fine, I said. Just thinking about work. The Peterson account? I nodded, even though in reality I was thinking about how to handle the next 72 hours. In my previous life, Daniel had left on March 18th. Today was the 15th. That gave me 3 days to figure out what I was going to do with the knowledge I had. The logical choice would be to confront him now, to tell him I knew about Lily's call that he'd received yesterday, to demand he choose between us before he made his decision. But I'd learned something in my 20 years of struggling alone, something that the naive 25-year-old version of me hadn't understood. Sometimes confrontation doesn't change people's minds. Sometimes it just makes them defensive. Sometimes the best way to win is not to play the game at all. I took a sip of my coffee and made a decision. I wasn't going to tell Daniel about the pregnancy. Not today, not in 3 days, not until I'd figured out exactly what I wanted my future to look like. Because the truth was, now that I was back here with all my memories intact, I wasn't sure I wanted to be married to a man who would abandon his pregnant wife. I wasn't sure I wanted to raise a child with someone who had shown me, through his actions, exactly how little our family meant to him. The old Maya would have fought for her marriage. The old Maya would have begged Daniel to stay, would have told him about the baby, would have believed that surely the news of impending fatherhood would make him choose differently. But I wasn't the old Maya anymore. I was a woman who'd spent 20 years learning to be strong because I had no other choice. I was a woman who'd built a life and raised a daughter and survived financial hardship and social stigma, and all the judgment that comes with being a single mother. And most importantly, I was a woman who died knowing that I'd wasted the best years of my life hoping a man who didn't love me would come back. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. Over the next 3 days, I watched Daniel carefully. I watched him check his phone constantly, smiling at messages he wouldn't let me see. I watched him become distant during conversations, his mind clearly somewhere else. I watched him pack his gym bag with more clothes than a single workout required. And on the evening of March 17th, I watched him receive a phone call that made him step out onto the balcony, closing the door behind him for privacy. In my original timeline, I hadn't noticed any of this. I'd been too wrapped up in my own joy about the pregnancy, too focused on imagining our future as parents, too naive to see the signs that my husband was planning his exit. But now, with the wisdom of hindsight and the pain of experience, I saw everything. That night, Daniel was quieter than usual during dinner. He kept glancing at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I knew what he was struggling with. He was trying to figure out how to tell me he was leaving. He was composing and rejecting various explanations in his head, trying to find one that would somehow make abandoning his wife seem reasonable or justified. "Daniel," I said, putting down my fork, "we need to talk." He looked up startled. "About what?" "About us. About our marriage. About where we're going." His face went pale. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been thinking a lot lately about what I want out of life, and I'm not sure this is it." The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but also liberating. In my previous life, I'd never questioned our relationship. I'd accepted whatever scraps of attention Daniel gave me and convinced myself it was enough. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" Daniel asked, and I could hear something in his voice. Not sadness or shock, but something that sounded almost like relief. "I'm saying I think we rushed into this marriage," I said carefully. "We'd only been dating 8 months when we got engaged. We got married 6 months after that. We barely know each other, Daniel. And lately it feels like we're more like roommates than spouses." Daniel started then stopped. He looked down at his plate. "I've been feeling that too." Of course he had. Because he'd been comparing our marriage to whatever fantasy he'd built up in his head about rekindling things with Lily. Because he'd been looking for reasons to justify his decision to leave. Because he'd already checked out of our relationship emotionally, and all that was left was the physical act of walking out the door. "So maybe we should talk about what that means," I continued. "Maybe we should discuss whether this marriage is what either of us really wants." Daniel looked up at me, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was wondering if this was a trap, if I somehow knew about Lily, if I was testing him. But he was also seeing an opportunity, a way out that didn't require him to be the bad guy, a chance to end our marriage without having to admit he was leaving me for another woman. "I don't want to hurt you," he said finally. "Then be honest with me." Do you want to stay married? The silence stretched between us. In my previous life, Daniel had left without ever having this conversation. He'd simply disappeared, leaving me to figure out on my own that our marriage was over. But now, facing a direct question, he couldn't avoid the truth. I don't know, he said quietly. I mean, I care about you, Maya, but I'm not sure I'm in love with you anymore. I'm not sure I ever was, really. We had fun together, and when you said you wanted to get married, I thought maybe that was what I wanted too. But lately, I've been wondering if we made a mistake. The words should have hurt. In my previous life, if Daniel had said this to me, it would have broken my heart. But now, after everything I knew, after all the years I'd spent raising our daughter alone while he was off living his life with Lily, these words felt more like vindication than injury. They confirmed what I'd always suspected but had been too afraid to acknowledge. Daniel had never really loved me the way I deserved to be loved. I've been wondering the same thing, I said, and watched surprise flash across his face. I think maybe we both got caught up in the idea of being married, of being adults with adult lives, without really thinking about whether we were right for each other. So what do we do? Daniel asked. I think we should separate, I said. Not necessarily divorce right away, but take some time apart to figure out what we really want. I could see the relief wash over him, quickly masked but unmistakable. This was exactly what he wanted, permission to leave without guilt. A narrative where the marriage failing was a mutual decision rather than his betrayal. That might be good, he said carefully. Give us both some space to think. And to be clear, I added, during this separation, we should both feel free to explore other options. If there's someone else you want to see, someone you've been thinking about, you should feel free to pursue that. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. Is there someone else you want to see? Not currently, I said truthfully. But I think we should both have that freedom. No judgment, no obligations. Just complete honesty about where we are. Okay, Daniel said slowly. So practically speaking, what does this look like? I think one of us should move out. Probably you. Since you have more flexibility with your job. This wasn't entirely true. Daniel's job required him to be in the office, while my accounting work could be done remotely if needed. But I wanted to make it easy for him to do what he was planning to do anyway. When? Daniel asked. Whenever you're ready. This weekend, next week, whatever works. I watched Daniel process this, watched him realize that I was giving him exactly what he wanted with none of the guilt or confrontation he'd been dreading. I watched him try to hide his eagerness behind a mask of reluctance and mature consideration. Maybe this weekend, he said. I could stay with Mike for a while, figure things out. Mike was his college roommate who lived across town. In my previous life, Daniel had told me he was staying with Mike when he'd actually moved in with Lily. I wondered if he'd use the same excuse this time, or if my unexpected cooperation had thrown off his prepared scripts. That sounds good, I said. And Daniel, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I think we both deserve to be with people who make us happy, and maybe that's not each other. There's no shame in admitting that. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. You're being really mature about this. Thank you. I smiled at him, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. A smile that hid all the knowledge I had about how this man would spend the next 20 years. I just want both of us to be happy. That night, I lay in bed listening to Daniel pack his things in the next room. He was trying to be quiet, but I could hear the sound of drawers opening and closing, hangers scraping in the closet, the zip of his suitcase. He was packing more than he would need for a temporary stay with Mike, and we both knew it. He was leaving just like he'd planned to, except now he could tell himself that it was mutual, that we'd both agreed this was best, that he hadn't abandoned his wife. Except I hadn't told him about the baby. That was my secret now, my choice, my decision about what to do next. And lying there in the dark, feeling the tiny life growing inside me, I realized something important. I didn't have to have this baby. In my previous life, I'd never even considered abortion as an option. I'd been raised Catholic, and the idea of not going through with the pregnancy hadn't even crossed my mind. But now, 20 years older and wiser, I understood that I had choices. I could terminate this pregnancy. I could have the baby and give it up for adoption. Or I could have the baby and raise it alone, just like I'd done before. But I also had another option, one that hadn't existed in my previous timeline. I could wait. I could let Daniel leave, let him go to Seattle with Lily, let him build whatever life he was going to build. And then, when I was ready, when I'd had time to think and plan and decide what I really wanted, I could tell him about the child we'd created. Or not. The choice was mine. The next morning, Daniel was gone when I woke up. There was a note on the kitchen counter. Took some clothes and essentials. I'll come back for the rest later. Thank you for understanding. We'll figure out the details soon. D. I read the note 3 times, remembering the different note he'd left in my previous life. That one had said, "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. I'll call you soon." He'd never called. I'd heard from his lawyer 6 weeks later, receiving divorce papers and a request to sign away his parental rights to a daughter he'd never met. This note was different. This note implied there might be ongoing communication, continued contact, some kind of mutual unwinding of our marriage instead of his unilateral abandonment. But I knew better. I knew that once Daniel left, once he got to Seattle and started his new life with Lily, I would become a footnote in his history, a mistake from his youth that he preferred not to think about. And you know what? I was okay with that, because I had something he didn't have. I had knowledge. I had the benefit of having lived through this once already. I knew which stocks would boom in the next few years. I knew which real estate investments would pay off. I knew which business trends would dominate the next 2 decades. And most importantly, I knew exactly how much time and energy I'd wasted in my previous life hoping Daniel would come back. I wasn't going to waste that time again. I spent the next 2 weeks executing the plan I'd been forming since the moment I'd woken up in my 25-year-old body. First, I went to the bank and opened a separate savings account in my name only, transferring half of our joint savings, my half the money I'd contributed from my job. Daniel would probably notice eventually, but by then it wouldn't matter. Next, I called my boss and asked for a meeting. Sharon Peters was the senior partner at the accounting firm where I worked. A brilliant woman in her 50s who'd built her career in an era when female accountants were still a rarity. In my previous life, I'd been too intimidated to really connect with her, but now, with 2 decades of additional life experience, I felt confident approaching her. "Maya," Sharon said, gesturing for me to sit down in her office, "what can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk to you about my career path here," I said. "I've been doing junior-level work for the past 2 years, but I think I'm ready for more responsibility. I want to know what I need to do to move up to senior accountant within the next year." Sharon looked surprised. In my previous life, I'd been content to stay in my junior role, focusing my energy on my pregnancy, and then on single motherhood. But that version of my life had led to decades of financial struggle, of being passed over for promotions because I had to leave early for daycare pickup, of being seen as less serious about my career because I was a single mother. "That's ambitious," Sharon said. "But I like ambition. What makes you think you're ready?" "I'm willing to put in the work," I said. "Extra hours, additional training, whatever it takes. I want to build a real career here, not just have a job." We talked for another 30 minutes, and by the end of the conversation, Sharon had laid out a clear path for my advancement. It would require evening classes to get my CPA certification, taking on additional client accounts, and proving I could handle complex audits. It would be demanding and time-consuming, and exactly what I needed to build the financial independence that had taken me 20 years to achieve in my previous life. But there was still the matter of the pregnancy. I was about 6 weeks along now, and I needed to make a decision. I scheduled an appointment with my doctor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, who'd been my OBGYN in my previous life and had delivered Emma. "So you're pregnant," Dr. Martinez said after running the tests. "About 6 weeks, like you thought. How are you feeling about it?" "Conflicted," I admitted. "My husband and I recently separated. He doesn't know about the pregnancy. Do you plan to tell him?" "I don't know. That's part of what I'm trying to figure out." Dr. Martinez nodded. "Well, you have options. If you're considering termination, you have time to make that decision. If you want to continue the pregnancy, we should start you on prenatal vitamins and schedule regular checkups. What if I'm not sure yet? Then take the time you need to be sure. This is your body and your life. No one else gets to make this decision for you." I left the doctor's office with a prescription for prenatal vitamins and a follow-up appointment in 3 weeks. I still hadn't decided what I was going to do, but I knew I had time. I knew I didn't have to rush this decision the way I'd rushed everything else in my previous life. Meanwhile, I'd heard through mutual friends that Daniel had moved to Seattle. The official story was that he'd gotten an amazing job offer that he couldn't pass up. Most people seemed to believe this, or at least they pretended to. No one mentioned Lily Wong, though I knew from social media stalking that she was also conveniently living in Seattle, and that Daniel's Facebook status had changed to "in a relationship" approximately 1 week after he left me. I didn't call him. I didn't email him. I didn't reach out at all. And interestingly, he didn't reach out to me either. Our marriage simply dissolved in silence, both of us apparently content to let it fade away without formal acknowledgement or closure. 2 months after Daniel left, I got a message from his lawyer. Daniel wanted a divorce. The terms were straightforward. We'd split our limited assets 50-50, no alimony on either side, clean break. There was also a mention that if there were any children from the marriage, custody would need to be addressed separately. I stared at that last line for a long time. I was 3 months pregnant now, starting to show slightly, though I'd been hiding it with loose clothing. Daniel's lawyer clearly didn't know about the pregnancy. Daniel didn't know about it, and this was my last chance to tell him. If I signed these divorce papers without mentioning the baby, I would be making a choice. I would be choosing to raise this child alone, without any input or support from Daniel. In my previous life, I'd told Daniel about Emma's existence, and he'd signed away his parental rights immediately. He'd wanted nothing to do with her. He'd made that abundantly clear through his lawyer, through his complete absence from her life, through his refusal to provide any financial support despite court orders. Knowing all of this, knowing exactly how little interest Daniel would have in being a father, I had to ask myself, what was the point of telling him? I signed the divorce papers without mentioning the pregnancy, and when I sent them back to the lawyer, I included a note saying I wanted to return to using my maiden name, Maya Chan. I wanted no connection to Daniel Zhang, no reminder of the marriage that had been a mistake from the beginning. 3 weeks later, I received the final divorce decree. I was officially single again at 25 years old, 3.5 months pregnant, and about to embark on a completely different life than the one I'd lived before. The first thing I did was use the money from the divorce settlement, my half of our joint savings plus my share of the equity from selling our apartment, as a down payment on a small condo in an up-and-coming neighborhood that I knew from my previous life would gentrify significantly over the next decade. In my timeline, this area's property values had increased tenfold. I was buying in at the ground floor. The second thing I did was throw myself into my career. I took on every difficult client Sharon offered me. I worked evenings and weekends studying for my CPA exam. I made myself indispensable at the firm, proving that I could handle complex audits and manage difficult client relationships. And when I passed my CPA exam on the first try, benefiting from having studied this material 20 years ago in my previous life, Sharon pulled me into her office. "You've impressed me, Maya," she said. "I'm promoting you to senior accountant, effective immediately. And I want to talk to you about something else. I'm looking to bring on a junior partner within the next few years. Someone who could eventually take over the firm when I retire. I think you might be that someone if you're interested." In my previous life, this conversation had never happened. I'd been too busy surviving as a single mother to focus on career advancement. But now, knowing what I knew, making the choices I was making, I was being offered an opportunity that could change everything. "I'm very interested," I said. "Good. There's a lot of work ahead, but I think you're up for it. Just one question, your personal situation. I noticed you're recently divorced. Are there any other major life changes I should know about? Anything that might affect your availability or commitment?" This was the moment. I was 5 months pregnant now, definitely showing, though I'd been strategic about my clothing choices and Sharon apparently hadn't noticed. I could tell her the truth that I was expecting a baby in 4 months. I could risk having this opportunity disappear because she thought I wouldn't be able to handle the demands of junior partnership with a newborn. Or I could do what I'd planned to do all along. "Actually, there is something," I said. "I'm pregnant. Due in October." Sharon's expression didn't change, which I took as a good sign. "I see. And the father?" "Out of the picture completely. It'll just be me and the baby." "Do you have support?" "Family, friends. My parents are in California, but they're excited about becoming grandparents. and I have friends here who'll help. I'm not worried about managing. Sharon nodded slowly. I appreciate your honesty. And I'm going to be honest with you too, Maya. This doesn't change my assessment of your potential. If anything, it makes me respect you more. Being a single mother isn't easy, and the fact that you're choosing to pursue your career aggressively despite that shows me the kind of determination I want in a partner. So the offer still stands? The offer still stands. With one addition, we're going to set you up with a flexible schedule after the baby arrives. Remote work when needed, adjusted hours, whatever you need to make this work. I don't believe in forcing women to choose between career and family. Good talent is too hard to find. I left Sharon's office feeling something I hadn't felt in my previous life until Emma was in college. Hope. Real genuine hope that I could have both a career and a child, that I didn't have to sacrifice one for the other, that being a single mother didn't mean condemning myself to decades of financial struggle and limited opportunities. Over the next 4 months, I prepared for Emma's arrival. Yes, I was having a girl again, the same daughter I'd raised in my previous life, though this version of her would grow up in very different circumstances. I bought a crib and a car seat and tiny clothes. I took childbirth classes and read parenting books. I told my parents about the pregnancy and accepted their offer to come stay with me for the first month after the baby arrived. And I thought a lot about what I was going to tell Emma someday about her father. In my previous life, I'd struggled with this constantly. Emma had asked about Daniel from a young age, and I'd never known quite what to say. I tried to be diplomatic, tried not to badmouth him to our daughter, tried to explain that sometimes people make choices we don't understand. But the truth was that Daniel's absence had hurt Emma deeply. She'd grown up feeling abandoned, wondering what was wrong with her that made her father not want to know her. This time would be different. This time, Emma wouldn't know anything different than having just a mother. This time, I could create a narrative from the beginning where her father wasn't an absent figure we waited for, but simply someone who'd never been part of our lives. It wasn't perfect, but it felt more honest than the lies I'd told in my previous timeline about how Daddy loved her but just couldn't be here. Emma was born on October 15, 2003, exactly when she'd been born in my previous life. Holding her in my arms for the second time, I was struck by how different everything felt. In my previous timeline, her birth had been tinged with sadness and fear. I'd been alone in the delivery room, terrified about how I was going to manage, grieving the family unit I'd thought I was building. But this time, I felt only joy and determination. This wasn't the end of my dreams. It was the beginning of a better version of them. My parents stayed for 6 weeks, helping me adjust to life with a newborn. My mother would watch Emma while I caught up on sleep or answered work emails. My father installed extra locks on all the doors and made sure I had everything I needed. They asked a few careful questions about Emma's father, and I told them the truth. He was someone I'd been married to briefly who wasn't interested in being a parent. They didn't push for more details. When my parents left and it was just Emma and me, I discovered something surprising. Single motherhood the second time around was actually easier. Yes, the physical demands were the same, the sleepless nights, the constant feedings, the exhaustion. But emotionally and practically, I was prepared in a way I hadn't been before. I knew what to expect. I knew which baby gear was essential and which was unnecessary. I knew how to batch cook meals during Emma's nap times. I knew how to maximize my sleep by sleeping when she slept instead of trying to catch up on housework. And most importantly, I had a career that supported me. Sharon had been true to her word about flexibility. I worked from home 3 days a week during Emma's first 6 months, going into the office only for essential meetings. I brought Emma with me sometimes, and Sharon's assistant would watch her during client calls. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. By the time Emma was a year old, I'd managed to save a significant amount of money, more than I'd had in savings by the time she was 10 in my previous life. I'd also invested strategically, putting money into tech stocks that I knew would boom, buying into companies like Google and Amazon when they were still relatively affordable. I couldn't invest everything I had because I needed to maintain my lifestyle and save for emergencies, but even modest investments in the right places were going to pay off enormously over the next decade. I also started documenting everything about Emma's life. In my previous timeline, I'd been too busy surviving to take many photos or write down milestones. But this time I kept a detailed journal about her first words, her first steps, her personality traits as they emerged. I took hundreds of photos, I saved every drawing she made, every card she gave me, because I knew from experience how quickly time passed, how soon she'd be grown and gone, and I wanted to savor every moment. When Emma was 2, Sharon made me a junior partner at the firm. I was 28 years old, and I'd achieved in 3 years what had taken most of the other partners 15 years to accomplish. Some of my colleagues were resentful, but Sharon shut down any complaints quickly. "Maya brings in more revenue than any of you," she told the partners at a meeting I wasn't supposed to know about. "She works harder than most people half her age with no kids. And she does it all while being a single mother. If any of you have a problem with that, you're welcome to match her billings next quarter." No one matched my billings. By the time Emma was in preschool, I was the firm's highest earner after Sharon herself. My salary had tripled from what I'd been making as a junior accountant, and combined with my smart investments, I was accumulating wealth at a rate that shocked me every time I checked my accounts. But money wasn't everything. What mattered more was the time I had with Emma. In my previous life, I'd worked such long hours trying to make ends meet that I'd missed huge chunks of her childhood. I'd missed school plays because I couldn't take time off work. I'd missed parent-teacher conferences because I had to cover an extra shift. I'd missed bedtime stories because I was too exhausted to do anything but collapse into bed after she was asleep. This time I made different choices. I made enough money that I could afford good childcare, which meant I didn't have to work evening and weekend shifts. I structured my schedule so I could drop Emma off at preschool and pick her up most days. I read to her every night without fail. I took her to the park on weekends. I was present in her life in a way I'd never been able to be before, and watching her thrive because of it filled me with a satisfaction I'd never imagined possible. The years passed. Emma started kindergarten, then first grade, then second grade. She was a bright, happy child, curious and confident in a way my previous Emma hadn't been until much later. She had friends and hobbies and a mother who was there for every birthday party and science fair. She never asked about her father because she'd never known anything different than our family of 2. I dated occasionally, but I wasn't in a rush to find a partner. I'd learned in my previous life that being alone was better than being with the wrong person. And I had too much to lose now to settle for someone who wasn't absolutely right for both me and Emma. Most of my dates didn't get past the second or third outing. Men seemed intimidated by my success, or they didn't want to date a single mother, or they expected me to prioritize them over my daughter and career in ways I wasn't willing to do. I was okay with that. I had Emma, I had my career, I had financial security, and I had the knowledge that I'd built all of this myself without depending on anyone. That was more than I'd ever had in my previous life. It wasn't until Emma was in 4th grade, 7 years after Daniel had left, that I heard from him again. I was at work when my assistant buzzed me. "Maya, there's someone here to see you. He says his name is Daniel Zhang, and that you used to be married." I felt my stomach drop. In my previous life, Daniel had never tried to contact me after he'd signed away his parental rights. Never sent a birthday card for Emma. Never called to check on her. Never acknowledged her existence in any way. So why was he here now? "Send him in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Daniel walked into my office, and I was struck by how much he'd changed and how much he'd stayed the same. He was 34 now, still wearing glasses, still handsome in that understated way. But there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his clothes were more expensive, designer labels that spoke to success and money. "Maya," he said, stopping just inside the doorway. "Thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I said truthfully. "What do you want, Daniel?" He glanced around my office, the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that Sharon had given me when I made junior partner, the expensive desk and leather chairs, the framed certifications on the wall. I could see him taking it all in, calculating, comparing this to whatever image he'd had of my life. "You've done well for yourself," he said. "Yes, I have. Now what do you want?" Daniel sat down without being invited, and I felt a flash of irritation. This was my office, my territory, my world that I'd built without him. He didn't get to just walk in and make himself comfortable. "I wanted to talk to you about our marriage," he said. "About how things ended. Our marriage ended 7 years ago, Daniel. We've both moved on. There's nothing to talk about." "But there is," he insisted. "I've been thinking about it a lot lately, about the mistakes I made, about how I handled things. I want to apologize." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. In my previous life, I would have given anything to hear Daniel apologize, to have him acknowledge the pain he'd caused. But now, after everything I'd accomplished, after building this life for myself and Emma, his apology felt hollow and unnecessary. Why now? I asked. Why, after 7 years of silence, do you suddenly feel the need to apologize? Daniel looked down at his hands. Because Lily and I broke up 6 months ago, and being alone for the first time in years, I've had a chance to reflect on my choices. I realize now that I handled our separation badly. I should have been more honest with you. I should have told you about Lily from the beginning instead of just leaving. So that was it. Daniel wasn't here because he genuinely felt remorse. He was here because his relationship had failed, and he was feeling nostalgic for the wife he'd abandoned. How predictable. I appreciate the apology, I said, my tone making it clear I didn't really appreciate it at all. But Daniel, that's all in the past. I've moved on. I have a life now that I'm very happy with. I've heard, Daniel said, and something in his tone made me sit up straighter. I've heard you have a daughter. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. How did he know about Emma? I'd been so careful to keep my personal life separate from anything he might have access to. We had no mutual friends anymore. I didn't use social media under my real name. How had he found out? Where did you hear that? I asked carefully. I ran into Mike last month. My old roommate, remember? He mentioned he'd seen you at a school event with a little girl who called you Mom. He said she looked about 7 years old. Mike, of course. He had kids at the same school where Emma went. I'd known there was a risk of running into Daniel's old friends, but I'd been so focused on keeping Emma away from Daniel himself that I hadn't thought through all the possible connections. Her name is Emma, Daniel continued. Mike said she's a beautiful little girl. Smart too, according to the teacher he was talking to. She is, I said, not confirming or denying anything else. Maya, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Daniel leaned forward, his expression intense. Is Emma my daughter? There it was. The question I'd been dreading since the moment he walked into my office. In my previous life, Daniel had known about Emma from the beginning and had chosen to sign away his rights. But in this timeline, I'd never told him. I'd built a life for Emma and myself that didn't include him in any way. And now, 7 years later, he was asking if he was her father. I could lie. I could tell him Emma was the result of a relationship I'd had after our divorce. But something stopped me, not honesty, not a sense of obligation to Daniel, but a practical consideration. If Daniel was asking this question, he might not stop until he got an answer. He might hire a private investigator, or worse, he might try to approach Emma directly. And I needed to control this narrative before it spiraled out of my hands. Yes, I said. Emma is your biological daughter. Daniel's face went white. You were pregnant when I left? I found out the day before we had our conversation about separating. I chose not to tell you. Why? Why wouldn't you tell me I was going to be a father? I looked at him incredulously. Daniel, you were planning to leave me for your ex-girlfriend. You'd already mentally checked out of our marriage. What exactly did you think telling you about the pregnancy would have accomplished? I had a right to know. Did you? I stood up, anger flooding through me. Anger from both timelines, from both versions of my life with this man. You abandoned your wife of less than 2 years. You moved to another city to be with another woman. You never called, never wrote, never asked how I was doing. You filed for divorce through a lawyer and never spoke to me directly again. What part of that behavior suggested you'd want to know about a baby? That's not fair, Maya. I didn't know you were pregnant. If I'd known. If you'd known, what? You would have stayed? No, you wouldn't have. You would have done exactly what you did in. I caught myself before I said too much, before I revealed that I knew with absolute certainty what he would have done because I'd lived through it before. You would have chosen Lily anyway. The only difference is you might have felt slightly more guilty about it. Daniel stood up too, his voice rising. That's not true. If I'd known I was going to be a father, I would have made different choices. I would have tried to make our marriage work. Would you though? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you made exactly the choices you wanted to make. And now, 7 years later, after your relationship with Lily fell apart, after you've built a whole life in Seattle without me, You suddenly want to play the victim and act like I did something wrong by not telling you about Emma. I'm not playing the victim. I'm just saying I had a right to know I had a daughter. Fine. You had a right to know. And I decided that right didn't outweigh my need to protect Emma from having an absent father. I decided that she was better off believing her father wasn't interested in being part of her life than knowing he'd chosen another woman over her before she was even born. So you just erased me from her life? You told her I didn't exist. I told her the truth, that her father wasn't part of our family. And you know what, Daniel? She's been perfectly happy. She's thriving. She doesn't feel like she's missing anything because she's never known anything different. So before you come in here on your high horse talking about your rights, maybe consider whether exercising those rights is actually in Emma's best interest or just in yours. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I want to meet her, he finally said. I want to be part of her life. Why? Because you suddenly developed paternal instincts? Or because you're lonely after your breakup, and you're looking for a new project? That's not fair. Fair? You want to talk to me about fair? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You know what's not fair, Daniel? Working 3 jobs while trying to raise a baby alone would be unfair. Being so broke that you have to choose between buying groceries or paying the electric bill would be unfair. Watching your daughter ask why other kids have daddies and she doesn't would be unfair. But I didn't have to deal with any of that. Do you know why? Because I made smart choices. Because I built a career that supports us. Because I didn't waste time or energy hoping you'd come back. I'm sorry I wasn't there, Daniel said quietly. I'm sorry you had to do it alone. But I'm here now and I want to make up for lost time. It doesn't work that way. You don't get to just walk in 7 years later and play dad because it's convenient for you now. So what are you saying? That I'll never get to meet my daughter? I sat back down, suddenly exhausted. This conversation was bringing up too many emotions from my previous life. Too many memories of the pain I'd felt when Daniel had abandoned us. But I had to think about Emma now, about what was best for her. Not about settling old scores with her father. I'm saying that if you want to be part of Emma's life, we do this on my terms, I said. We do this carefully, with her needs at the center of every decision. We don't just spring you on her as her long-lost father. We don't disrupt her life because you're having a crisis and want to reconnect with your roots, or whatever you think this is. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that you give me time to think about this and figure out the best way to approach it. I need to talk to a family therapist. I need to prepare Emma for the possibility of meeting you. And I need to know that you're serious about this, that this isn't just a whim that's going to fade when the novelty wears off, or when you meet someone new. How do I prove I'm serious? Start by respecting my boundaries. Don't try to contact Emma directly. Don't show up at her school or anywhere else she might be. Let me control how and when this happens. Daniel nodded slowly. Okay. I can do that. But Maya, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this to hurt you or to disrupt Emma's life. I genuinely want to know my daughter. I've missed 7 years of her life, and I can't get that back. But I'd like to be part of her future if you'll let me. We'll see, I said. Give me your number. I'll call you when I've figured out how to handle this. Daniel wrote his number on a piece of paper and handed it to me. Thank you for even considering it. I know I don't deserve your understanding, but I appreciate it anyway. After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the piece of paper with his phone number. I was furious with him for showing up after all these years, for disrupting the life I'd built, for assuming he had a right to Emma just because of biology. But I was also struggling with a question I hadn't expected to face. Was I being fair to Emma by keeping her father away? In my previous life, Daniel's absence had hurt Emma deeply. She'd spent years wondering about him, asking questions I couldn't answer, feeling incomplete because she didn't have a father. But in this timeline, Emma didn't know any different. She had a happy, stable life with a mother who was there for her and enough money that we didn't have to stress about basic necessities. Would introducing Daniel into that equation improve her life or complicate it? I called my therapist, Dr. Sarah Johnson, whom I'd started seeing shortly after Emma was born. In my previous life, I couldn't afford therapy. But this time, with my higher income, I'd made mental health a priority. Dr. Johnson had helped me process a lot of the complicated emotions from my previous timeline. though I'd been careful to frame them as fears and worries, rather than actual memories from a life I'd already lived. My ex-husband showed up at my office today, I told her during our emergency session that evening. He wants to meet Emma. And how do you feel about that? Dr. Johnson asked. Angry, protective, confused. Part of me wants to tell him to get lost, that he gave up his right to know her when he left me. But another part of me wonders if I'm being selfish, if Emma deserves a chance to know her father even if he is 7 years late. What does Emma know about her father? Not much. She's asked occasionally, and I've told her that her daddy and I weren't married very long and that he lives far away and isn't part of our family. She seemed okay with that answer so far. Has she expressed a desire to meet him? Not recently. When she was younger, maybe 4 or 5, she asked a few times why other kids had daddies and she didn't. But once I explained that families come in all different shapes and sizes, and that our family was just the 2 of us, she seemed satisfied with that. So the question is whether meeting her father would enhance Emma's life or complicate it, Dr. Johnson said. And that's something only you can determine, based on your knowledge of both Emma and her father. In my heart, I don't trust him, I admitted. I don't trust that he'll stick around. I don't trust that he won't hurt her. And I'm afraid that if I let him into her life and then he disappears again, it'll be worse for her than never knowing him at all. Those are valid concerns. Do you think there's a way to test his commitment before involving Emma? That gave me an idea. Actually, yes. I think there is. The next day I called Daniel. I've thought about your request to meet Emma, I said. And I have some conditions. Okay. What are they? First, I want you to see a family therapist with me. We need to work through the issues from our marriage and divorce before we can co-parent effectively. I can do that. Second, you don't meet Emma until I'm convinced you're committed to being a consistent presence in her life. That means regular therapy sessions, regular check-ins with me, demonstrating over a period of at least 3 months that you're serious about this. 3 months? Maya, I want to meet my daughter, not jump through hoops. Those are my terms, Daniel. Take them or leave them. There was a long pause. Fine. I'll do it. And third, if and when you do meet Emma, you don't tell her you're her father right away. We introduce you as an old friend of mine first, let her get comfortable with you, and then gradually explain who you are. I won't have her life upended all at once. That seems overly cautious. That's how it has to be. Emma's welfare is more important than your desire for instant gratification. Okay, Daniel said, though I could hear the frustration in his voice. When do we start? We started therapy the following week. Dr. Lisa Chun was a family therapist who specialized in co-parenting and blended families, and she didn't pull any punches with either of us. Daniel, you abandoned your pregnant wife for another woman, she said bluntly during our first session. That's the reality we're working with here. Now you want back into your daughter's life 7 years later. Can you understand why Maya is skeptical about your motives? I didn't know she was pregnant, Daniel protested. But would it have changed anything if you had? Dr. Chun asked. Really? Daniel was quiet. I think you need to be honest with yourself and with Maya about what you really want here. Dr. Chun continued. Are you interested in being Emma's father because you genuinely want to build a relationship with her? Or are you trying to fill a void that Lily left? Or are you trying to assuage guilt about choices you made 7 years ago? I don't know, Daniel admitted. Maybe a little bit of all of those things. But does that make my desire to know my daughter any less legitimate? It might make it less stable, Dr. Chun said. Which is exactly Maya's concern. If you're doing this because you're lonely or guilty, what happens when you're not lonely or guilty anymore? What happens if you meet someone new and decide that having an 8-year-old daughter is inconvenient for your new relationship? I wouldn't do that. You did it once before. The sessions continued. Week after week, Daniel and I sat in Dr. Chen's office and worked through the wreckage of our brief marriage and his 7-year absence. It was painful and exhausting, and there were times I wanted to call the whole thing off. But I kept thinking about Emma, about whether she might benefit from knowing her father, and that kept me coming back. During one session about 2 months in, Dr. Chun asked Daniel what he imagined his relationship with Emma would look like. I want to be her dad, Daniel said. I want to take her to the park and help her with homework and be there for school events. I want her to know that she has a father who loves her. That's a nice picture, Dr. Chun said. But let's be practical. You live in Seattle. Emma lives here. How do you envision maintaining a consistent presence in her life with that kind of distance? Daniel was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about moving back, he said. My company has an office here. I could transfer. I looked at him in surprise. You'd move back here just to be near Emma? I would. If you'd let me be part of her life, I'd move back. This was something I hadn't expected. In my previous life, Daniel had stayed in Seattle, building a life there with Lily that had lasted 2 decades. But in this timeline, with Lily out of the picture and Emma's existence known to him, he was considering giving up his life in Seattle to come back. That's a big decision, Dr. Chun said. Have you really thought it through? I have. I've been thinking about it since I found out about Emma. Seattle was where Lily wanted to be, not necessarily where I wanted to be. And now that she's gone, I don't have a reason to stay there. My family is here. My old friends are here. And my daughter is here. I felt something shift inside me. Daniel might actually be serious about this. He might actually be willing to make significant life changes to be part of Emma's life. That didn't erase the 7 years he'd been absent, but it was more commitment than I'd expected from him. If you move back, I said carefully, where would you live? I don't know yet. Probably get an apartment near your condo if that's okay with you. I want to be close enough that I can see Emma regularly, but not so close that I'm invading your space. And your job. I've already talked to my boss about transferring. It wouldn't be a problem. I'd actually be getting a promotion if I moved to the local office. They need a senior engineer and I'm qualified. Dr. Chun looked between us. It sounds like Daniel is demonstrating commitment. The question is whether you're ready to let him into Emma's life, Maya. I took a deep breath. I need to prepare Emma first. I need to talk to her about her father and see how she responds to the idea of meeting him. But yes, I think we're getting close to that point. That night, I sat down with Emma after dinner. She was 7 years old now, in 2nd grade, full of energy and opinions and questions about everything. She looked so much like Daniel. The same dark hair, the same eyes, the same serious expression when she was thinking hard about something. But she had my smile and my determination and my ability to focus intensely on things that interested her. Emma, honey, I need to talk to you about something important, I said. She looked up from her drawing. Am I in trouble? No, baby, you're not in trouble. I want to talk to you about your father. Emma put down her crayon. We'd had this conversation a few times over the years, but not recently. What about him? Well, you know how I've told you that your daddy and I weren't married very long and that he lives far away? Emma nodded. The truth is a little more complicated than that. Your daddy didn't know about you when you were born. I didn't tell him I was pregnant because we decided to get a divorce, and I thought it would be easier for both of us if we went our separate ways. So he doesn't know I exist? Emma asked, her eyes wide. He didn't know. But recently he found out. And he wants to meet you. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Does he want to be my dad now? He says he does. But I wanted to talk to you first, to see how you feel about meeting him. Is he nice? He's complicated. He made some choices when we were married that hurt me, but that doesn't mean he's not a good person. I honestly don't know what kind of father he'll be, because he's never had the chance to be one before. Do you want me to meet him? I pulled Emma into my lap, even though she was getting a bit big for it. What I want is for you to be happy. If you want to meet your father, I'll make that happen. If you don't, that's okay too. This is your choice, baby. Emma thought about it, her brow furrowed in concentration. Can I ask him questions? Of course you can. Like why he left. Like why he left. Okay, Emma said. I want to meet him. But I want you to be there too. I'll be right there the whole time, I promised. 2 weeks later, we met Daniel at a park near our condo. I told Emma we were meeting an old friend of mine first, easing into the revelation that he was her father. Daniel was already there when we arrived, sitting on a bench and looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. Emma, I said. This is Daniel. Daniel, this is Emma. Hi, Emma, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. It's really nice to meet you. Emma studied him carefully, taking in his features and comparing them to her own. Kids are perceptive. I could see her noting the resemblances, making connections. You look like me, Emma said finally. I do, don't I? Daniel said, smiling. We have the same eyes. Mom, is this my dad? Emma asked, turning to me. So much for the gradual revelation plan. Yes, sweetheart. This is your father. Emma looked back at Daniel. Why did you leave my mom? Daniel glanced at me and I nodded slightly. This was the moment of truth, where he had to be honest with a 7-year-old about choices that were too complicated for adult relationships, let alone child understanding. I made a mistake, Daniel said slowly. I thought I wanted something different, someone different, and I left your mom to go be with someone else. But I didn't know about you. If I'd known you existed, I like to think I would have made different choices. But you would have left my mom anyway, Emma said. It wasn't a question. Daniel looked startled by her insight. Probably yes. Your mom and we weren't right for each other. We got married too quickly, and we didn't know each other well enough. So if you'd known about me, you and mom still wouldn't be together? No, probably not. But I would have been part of your life from the beginning. I would have been your dad. Are you going to be my dad now? I'd like to try if you'll let me. Emma looked at me again, seeking reassurance. I squeezed her hand. It's okay, baby. We can take it slow and see how it goes. We spent the next hour at the park, Daniel awkwardly trying to connect with a daughter he'd never known, Emma cautiously opening up to a father who was essentially a stranger. It wasn't the heartwarming reunion you see in movies. It was awkward and tentative and filled with long silences. But it was a beginning. Over the next few months, Daniel visited regularly. He moved back to town as he'd promised, got an apartment a few miles from our condo, and started the slow process of building a relationship with Emma. He attended her soccer games and school concerts. He took her out for ice cream and helped her with math homework. He learned her likes and dislikes, her fears and dreams, all the things I'd known about her since birth that he had to discover now. And gradually Emma warmed up to him. She started calling him Dad instead of Daniel. She got excited when it was his day to visit. She introduced him to her friends as her father, navigating their questions about why she'd never mentioned him before with a simple, "He lived far away but now he's back." Watching their relationship develop, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. I was glad Emma had a father figure in her life now. Glad she didn't have to wonder anymore about the man who'd contributed half her DNA. But I was also protective, always watching for signs that Daniel might pull away, might get bored or overwhelmed, might decide that fatherhood was more than he'd bargained for. And there was another feeling too, one I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore: jealousy. I'd done all the hard work of raising Emma for 7 years. I'd been there for every skin knee and bad dream, every first day of school and last day of school, every milestone and setback. And now Daniel got to swoop in and be the fun dad, the one who took her for treats and didn't have to enforce bedtime or make her eat her vegetables. But that wasn't fair, I reminded myself. Daniel was doing the best he could with the opportunity he had. And Emma deserved to have both parents involved in her life, even if one of them had gotten a 7-year late start. It wasn't until Emma's 8th birthday, a year after Daniel had come back into our lives, that everything changed again. We were having a small party at our condo, just Emma and a few of her school friends, Daniel and me co-hosting for the first time. The kids were running around playing games while Daniel and I stood in the kitchen preparing snacks. "She's amazing," Daniel said, watching Emma through the doorway as she laughed with her friends. "You did an incredible job raising her, Maya." "Thank you," I said, meaning it. Daniel had been consistent over the past year, proving that his commitment to Emma was genuine. He'd earned the right to compliment my parenting. "I've been thinking," Daniel continued, "about the future, about what Emma's life will look like as she gets older." "Okay, what about it?" "I want to be more than just the fun dad who visits 3 times a week. I want to be a real parent with real responsibilities. I want to make decisions with you about her education and her health and her future." That's what co-parenting is, Daniel. We can work toward that. But I also want Emma to have stability. Right now, she lives with you full-time, and I see her when it's convenient. I want her to feel like she has 2 homes, not just one home and a place she visits sometimes. "What are you suggesting?" I'm suggesting we work out a formal custody arrangement. Maybe she stays with me a few nights a week, builds a real relationship with my side of the family, feels like my apartment is her home too. This was reasonable. This was what co-parents did. But something about the way Daniel said it made me uneasy. We can discuss that, I said carefully. Though I'd want to make sure any arrangement we create is what's best for Emma, not just what's convenient for us. Of course, Daniel said. Emma's welfare is my priority too. But over the next few months, as we negotiated custody arrangements and parenting schedules, I started to see a side of Daniel I hadn't expected. He'd become possessive of Emma, competitive about parenting decisions, insistent that his way was better than mine for everything from what she ate to how she should spend her weekends. It came to a head when Emma came home from a weekend at Daniel's house and told me that he'd asked her if she wanted to live with him full-time. He said that if I lived with him, I could have my own room that we'd decorate however I wanted, Emma said. And I could get a dog because his apartment allows pets and yours doesn't. I felt rage rising in my chest. What did you tell him? I said I'd think about it. But Mom, I don't want to leave you. I do kind of want a dog. We can get a dog, sweetheart. We can move to a place that allows pets if that's what you want. But you need to know that no matter what your dad says, I'm not going to let you go anywhere you don't want to go. That night, after Emma was in bed, I called Daniel. We need to talk. Now. We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory where I was less likely to say something I'd regret. You asked Emma if she wanted to live with you full-time, I said without preamble. Without discussing it with me first. I was just gauging her interest, Daniel said. She's getting older. She should have a say in where she lives. She's 8 years old, Daniel. She's not old enough to make that decision. And you putting ideas in her head about dogs and fancy bedrooms is manipulative. I'm not trying to manipulate anyone. I'm trying to be a father to my daughter. Is that so wrong? You're trying to make up for lost time by competing with me for Emma's affection. And that's exactly what I was afraid of when you first came back. That's not what I'm doing. Isn't it? For 7 years I was enough for Emma. We were a team, a family, just the two of us. And now you show up and suddenly that's not good enough? Suddenly Emma needs to split her time between us like she's a possession to be shared. She is my daughter, Maya. I have rights too. Rights you ignored for 7 years. Rights you only claimed when your relationship fell apart, and you needed something to fill the void. Well, Emma's not a void filler, Daniel. She's a child who needs stability and consistency, not a father who's going to compete with her mother for her love. We were attracting attention from other customers, but I didn't care. All the anger I'd been holding back from both timelines was pouring out. You think I'm competing with you? Daniel asked. Maya, I'm trying to build a relationship with my daughter. If that makes you feel threatened, that's your issue to work through. I don't feel threatened. I feel protective. Because I know you, Daniel. I know how you operate. You're all in when something is new and exciting. But what happens when the novelty wears off? What happens when being a dad gets boring or inconvenient? Are you going to disappear again and leave Emma wondering what she did wrong? I'm not going to disappear. You already did once. Why should I believe you won't do it again? Daniel stood up abruptly. You know what? I don't have to defend myself to you. I've spent a year proving my commitment to Emma. I've rearranged my entire life to be near her. I've been patient and respectful of your boundaries. But clearly nothing I do is ever going to be enough for you. You're always going to see me as the guy who left you, not as Emma's father who deserves a chance to be in her life. You're right, I said. I am always going to see you as the guy who left, because you are that guy. And no amount of showing up for soccer games now changes the fact that you abandoned your pregnant wife. You don't get to rewrite history, Daniel. I'm not trying to rewrite history. I'm trying to write a new future. But you won't let me because you're too busy punishing me for the past. He left then and I sat in the coffee shop feeling shaky and sick. Was he right? Was I being unfair by not fully letting him into Emma's life? Or was I right to protect Emma from getting too attached to a father who might disappear again? I didn't know. And for the first time since I'd woken up in my 25-year-old body with the knowledge of my previous life, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake by not telling Daniel about the pregnancy from the beginning. That night, unable to sleep, I lay in bed thinking about both timelines of my life. In the first timeline, Daniel had known about Emma and had immediately signed away his rights. He'd never wanted to be a father, never wanted the responsibility, never looked back. That had hurt Emma deeply, but at least she'd never had to experience the pain of getting to know him and then losing him again. In this timeline, I'd hidden the pregnancy, raised Emma alone for 7 years, and then Daniel had found out and come back into our lives. Emma had a father now, but the situation was complicated and fraught with conflict. Was this better than the first timeline? Or had I just traded one kind of pain for another? I couldn't know for sure. But lying there in the dark, I realized something important. I couldn't control Daniel's choices. I couldn't prevent him from disappointing Emma if that's what he was going to do. All I could control was my own behavior, my own reactions, my own choices about how to navigate this complicated co-parenting relationship. The next morning I called Daniel. "I want to apologize for last night," I said. "I said some things that weren't fair." "I'm sorry too," Daniel said. "I shouldn't have asked Emma about living with me without talking to you first. That was wrong. I think we need to go back to therapy," I said. "Just you and me, not with Emma yet. We need to figure out how to co-parent effectively without all this conflict." "I agree. I'll call Dr. Chun today." Over the next few months, Daniel and I worked hard on our co-parenting relationship. We went to therapy twice a week, learning how to communicate better, how to put Emma's needs ahead of our own egos, how to work together instead of against each other. It was exhausting and emotional, but gradually we found a rhythm that worked. We established a custody schedule that gave Emma stability, while allowing Daniel to be meaningfully involved in her life. She spent weekday nights with me and weekend nights alternating between us. We communicated about homework and doctor's appointments and social activities. We showed up together for school events, presenting a united front even though we were no longer married. And slowly, I learned to trust that Daniel wasn't going to disappear. He proved himself over time, showing up even when it was inconvenient, following through on promises, being consistent in a way he'd never been during our brief marriage. He wasn't perfect. He was still sometimes competitive with me, still sometimes tried to be the fun parent instead of the responsible one, but he was there. And for Emma, that made all the difference. By the time Emma was 10, our co-parenting relationship had settled into something that almost looked functional. We'd stopped fighting about every little decision. We'd learned to compromise. We'd figured out how to attend school events together without it being awkward. We weren't friends exactly, but we were partners in raising our daughter, and that was enough. But then something unexpected happened. Daniel started dating again. Her name was Jennifer Park, and she was a teacher at Emma's school. She was kind and warm and genuinely seemed to like Emma. When Daniel first mentioned that he was seeing someone, I told myself I was fine with it. I was happy for him. Emma deserved to see her father in a healthy relationship. This was good. Except I wasn't fine with it. And I wasn't happy for him. Because watching Daniel fall in love with someone else, someone who wasn't Lily, someone who represented a real future and not just a rekindled college romance, made me realize something I'd been trying not to acknowledge. I'd never really stopped loving Daniel. Not the Daniel who'd left me. Not the Daniel who'd chosen Lily over me and our unborn child. But the Daniel who showed up for Emma's school concerts and helped her with her science projects and patiently taught her how to ride a bike. The Daniel who'd proven over 3 years of consistent co-parenting that he could be reliable and committed and present in a way he'd never been during our marriage. I was in love with a man who'd broken my heart twice, once in each timeline of my life, and who was now building a future with someone else. And I had no one to blame but myself, because I'd pushed him away at every opportunity, unable to fully forgive or forget his abandonment. The realization hit me one Saturday afternoon when Daniel brought Emma home from a weekend at his place and Jennifer was with them. They were holding hands, laughing at something Emma had said, looking for all the world like a happy family. And I felt something sharp and painful in my chest that took me a moment to identify as jealousy. "Mom, guess what?" Emma said, running up to me. "Jennifer is taking us to the aquarium next weekend. She says they have a new penguin exhibit." "That sounds fun, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "You could come too if you want," Jennifer offered, and I could see she meant it sincerely. She wasn't trying to replace me or push me out. She was just trying to be kind. "Thank you, but I have work to catch up on," I lied. You three go and have fun. Later that night, after Emma was in bed, I sat in my living room crying for the first time since I'd woken up in my 25-year-old body. I'd been so strong, so focused, so determined to build a better life than the one I'd had in my previous timeline. And I had built that life. I had the career, the financial security, the beautiful daughter who was thriving. I had everything I dreamed of. Everything except love. Everything except partnership. Everything except someone to share my life with. In my previous timeline, I'd been alone because Daniel had left and I'd never found anyone else. But in this timeline, I was alone because I'd chosen to be. I'd been so focused on protecting myself and Emma from getting hurt that I'd never let anyone close enough to matter. I'd dated occasionally, but I'd never given anyone a real chance. I'd convinced myself I was better off alone, that independence was more valuable than companionship. But watching Daniel fall in love with Jennifer, seeing what I could have had if I'd been able to forgive and move forward, I realized I'd been lying to myself. I wasn't better off alone. I was just scared. The next morning, I called Dr. Johnson for an emergency session. I think I'm in love with my ex-husband, I told her. And I think I've been in love with him for a while now, but I was too angry and hurt to admit it. What changed? Dr. Johnson asked. He's dating someone else. Someone good for him, someone Emma likes. And seeing them together made me realize what I've been missing. So what do you want to do about it? I don't know. It's too late, isn't it? He's happy with Jennifer. Emma's happy with Jennifer. I can't just tell him I have feelings for him and mess up what he's building. Why not? Because it's selfish. Because he's moved on. Because I had 3 years to say something and I didn't. Those are all reasons not to tell him, Dr. Johnson said. But what's the reason to tell him? I thought about that. Because I don't want to spend another 20 years wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to be honest about my feelings. Then that's your answer. But knowing I should tell Daniel and actually doing it were two different things. I spent weeks building up the courage, planning what I would say, imagining all the ways he might respond. And then one afternoon the decision was made for me. Daniel showed up at my office unannounced, something he hadn't done since that day 3 years earlier when he'd asked about Emma. But this time he looked nervous rather than determined. We need to talk, he said. Okay. What about? About Jennifer. About our relationship. My heart sank. He was going to tell me they were getting engaged. Or maybe that Jennifer was pregnant. Or that they were moving in together. Whatever it was going to make my confession impossible. What about your relationship? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. I ended it, Daniel said. I stared at him. You what? I broke up with Jennifer. Last week. Why? You two seemed happy together. Emma loved her. We were happy. And Emma did love her. But I realized something, and once I realized it, I couldn't unrealize it. What did you realize? Daniel sat down, running his hands through his hair. I realized I was using Jennifer as a replacement for something I actually wanted. Someone I actually wanted. And it wasn't fair to her to keep dating her when my heart wasn't fully in it. I don't understand. Maya, I'm in love with you. I think I've been in love with you for a while now, maybe since I came back into Emma's life, maybe longer. But I convinced myself it was impossible, that you'd never forgive me for leaving, that I should move on and find someone else. So I dated Jennifer and she was wonderful, but she wasn't you. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Daniel, the man I'd been married to and divorced from, the man who'd abandoned me twice across 2 timelines, the man I'd spent 3 years trying not to love, was sitting in my office telling me he loved me. You can't be serious, I finally managed to say. I'm completely serious. Maya, I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I hurt you so badly that you'd be absolutely justified in telling me to get lost. But I had to tell you how I feel. I couldn't keep pretending I didn't. When? I asked. When did you realize? Honestly? That day at the coffee shop 3 years ago when we had that huge fight about Emma. You were so fierce, so protective, so absolutely certain of your convictions. And I realized that the woman I'd been married to all those years ago, the woman I'd thought was too passive and accommodating, had become someone strong and independent and incredible. And I realized I'd been an idiot to let you go. You didn't let me go, I said quietly. You ran away. You're right. I did. And I've spent every day since coming back into your life trying to prove that I'm not that person anymore. That I can be reliable and trustworthy and present. But I understand if it's not enough. I understand if you can't forgive me. I just needed you to know how I feel. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw something I'd never seen in either timeline: vulnerability. He wasn't trying to justify his past behavior or make excuses. He wasn't defensive or entitled. He was just being honest about his feelings and accepting that I might reject him. I need to tell you something too, I said. Something I've been too scared to admit even to myself. Okay. I'm in love with you too. And I hate that I am, because it feels like a betrayal of everything I promised myself after you left. I promised I'd never depend on anyone again. I promised I'd never give someone the power to hurt me the way you hurt me. But somehow, watching you be a father to Emma, watching you show up and be consistent and reliable, I fell in love with you anyway. Daniel's eyes widened. Really? Really? But Daniel, I need you to understand something. If we try this, if we give this relationship another chance, there are no third chances. If you hurt Emma again, if you disappear again, if you prove that this version of you is just as unreliable as the old version, I won't forgive you. Not for my sake, but for Emma's. I understand. And Maya, I need you to understand something too. I'm not asking to rush into anything. I know we have a lot of history to work through, a lot of trust to rebuild. I'm willing to take this as slowly as you need. What does that even look like? We've been divorced for 10 years. We have a 10-year-old daughter together. We can't exactly start over and pretend none of that happened. We don't pretend it didn't happen. We acknowledge it, learn from it, and build something new that takes into account everything we've been through. I thought about my 2 lives, about all the different versions of this relationship I'd experienced. In my first timeline, Daniel had left and never come back, and I'd spent 20 years alone. In this timeline, I'd pushed him away initially, but he'd fought his way back into Emma's life. And now he was fighting for a place in mine. Maybe this was my chance to finally get it right. To finally have the life I'd always wanted, but had been too afraid to reach for. I want to try, I said. But we do this right. We go slow. We continue therapy. We make sure Emma's okay with this before we make any big changes. Absolutely. Whatever you need. And Daniel? I need you to be absolutely certain. Because I can survive you leaving me again. I did it once already. But Emma shouldn't have to survive you leaving both of us as a family. So if you have any doubts, any reservations, tell me now. I don't have doubts, Daniel said. Maya, I know I haven't earned your trust yet. But I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life proving that I'm serious about this. About you, about Emma, about building a real family with both of you. We started dating in secret at first, not telling Emma until we were sure it was going to work. We went out to dinner when she was with friends. We talked on the phone late at night after she was asleep. We took things slowly, learning each other again, discovering who we'd become in the years since our brief, disastrous marriage. And gradually I let my guard down. I let Daniel back into my heart, not as the man who'd hurt me but as the man he'd become. I forgave him for leaving me, for choosing Lily, for all the pain he'd caused in both timelines. I forgave him because holding on to that anger was preventing me from being happy, and I deserved to be happy. 6 months later, we told Emma we were dating. To our surprise, she wasn't shocked at all. I already knew, she said matter-of-factly. I saw Dad kiss you when he thought I wasn't looking. And you're okay with it? I asked. Are you kidding? This is like the best thing ever. If you guys get married, I can have both my parents in the same house all the time. Daniel and I looked at each other. Marriage. We hadn't gotten that far in our planning yet, but apparently Emma had been thinking ahead. We're not there yet, sweetheart, I said carefully. We're just dating and seeing how it goes. But you could get married someday, right? Maybe someday, Daniel said. But that's a long way off. Except it wasn't as long as we thought. A year later, Daniel proposed. Not with a grand gesture or a public display, but quietly at home with Emma there to witness it. Maya-chan, he said, getting down on one knee in our living room. I asked you to marry me once before when we barely knew each other, when we were too young and too naive to understand what marriage really meant. I'd like to ask you again now that we're older and wiser, now that we've been through everything together, now that we know exactly what we're getting into. Will you marry me? I looked at the ring he was holding. Not the small solitaire from our first engagement, but something new and beautiful that represented this new chapter in our lives. And then I looked at Emma, who was watching us with eyes full of hope. Yes, I said. I'll marry you. Emma cheered and threw herself at both of us, and we all ended up in a pile on the floor, laughing and crying and planning the wedding we all wanted. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony with just close friends and family. Emma was our flower girl, beaming as she walked down the aisle ahead of me. And when Daniel and I exchanged vows, they weren't the generic promises we'd made the first time. They were personal and specific, acknowledging everything we'd been through and promising to do better this time. I promise to stay, Daniel said. No matter how hard things get, no matter what opportunities or temptations might arise, I promise to stay and work through it with you. I promise to trust you, I said. To not punish you forever for past mistakes, to give you the benefit of the doubt, to believe that you're the man you've proven yourself to be and not the man you used to be. After the ceremony, as we danced at our reception with Emma between us, I thought about both of my lives. In my first timeline, I died alone, never having forgiven Daniel, never having found happiness beyond my daughter. In this timeline, I'd made different choices at every turn, and those choices had led me to this moment. Remarried to the man who'd once left me, with a daughter who finally had both her parents together, building a family that was complicated and unconventional but ultimately full of love. It wasn't the perfect fairy tale ending. We still had challenges ahead, blending our lives completely after living separately for so long, navigating the dynamics of being parents who'd gotten back together, working through the trauma of our past together. But we were committed to facing those challenges as a team, and that made all the difference. 5 years later, Emma was 15, rebellious and brilliant and testing boundaries in all the normal teenage ways. Daniel and I had been remarried for 5 years, and in that time we'd had another child. A son named Alex who was Emma's complete opposite, easygoing and quiet where she was intense and opinionated. One night, after a particularly difficult argument with teenage Emma about curfew, Daniel and I collapsed on the couch together. Parenting a teenager is harder than I imagined, Daniel said. Just wait until Alex hits the teenage years, I replied. Then we'll really be in trouble. Do you ever regret it? Daniel asked. Giving me another chance? Taking me back? I thought about that question carefully. Did I regret it? There were still moments when the old hurt resurfaced, when I remembered how he'd left me, when I wondered if I'd been foolish to trust him again. But those moments were becoming rarer, overshadowed by years of him proving his commitment. No, I said finally. I don't regret it. Do you? Never. You and Emma and Alex, you're my whole world. I can't imagine my life without you. Even when Emma is screaming at us about how we're ruining her life by not letting her go to a concert on a school night? Especially then, Daniel said, laughing. Though I might need to reevaluate that stance if she keeps slamming doors. Later that night, lying in bed next to Daniel with him asleep beside me, I thought about the impossible journey I'd been on. I died and come back to life. I'd been given a second chance to rewrite my story, and I'd chosen a path that was harder in some ways than my first life. A path that required forgiveness and vulnerability and trust, but ultimately so much more rewarding. In my first life, I'd raised Emma alone and died with regrets about what might have been. In this life, I'd raised Emma with support, found love again, and built a family that was messy and imperfect but genuine. I'd learned that happy endings aren't about everything being perfect. They're about choosing to work through the imperfections with people who are worth the effort. The next morning, Emma came downstairs and apologized for her behavior the night before. I'm sorry I yelled at you guys, she said. I know you're just trying to look out for me. I just wish you trusted me more. We do trust you, I told her. We just also remember being 15 and making questionable decisions. We're trying to save you from our mistakes. What kind of mistakes did you make? Emma asked, suddenly curious. Daniel and I exchanged glances. We told Emma an abbreviated version of our history, but not the full story. Well, I said carefully, your dad and I got married very young, barely knowing each other. That was a mistake. We rushed into things because we thought we were in love, but we hadn't taken the time to really understand each other or figure out if we were compatible. And then I made an even bigger mistake, Daniel added. I left your mom when our marriage got hard instead of staying and working through it. That's not something I'm proud of, and it's something I've spent years trying to make up for. But you came back, Emma said. You fixed it. Eventually, I said. But it took a long time and a lot of work. That's what we're trying to teach you, Emma. Relationships, whether they're friendships or romantic relationships or parent-child relationships, take work. They take communication and trust and willingness to push through the hard times. We don't want you to make the same mistakes we made. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. Do you think you'd still have gotten back together if you'd known from the beginning how hard it would be? Yes, Daniel said without hesitation. Because the hard work has been worth it to have this family. Even when I'm being a nightmare teenager? Especially when you're being a nightmare teenager, I said, pulling her into a hug. Because you're our nightmare teenager, and we wouldn't trade you for the world. That conversation stayed with me for days afterward. Emma had asked if we'd still choose each other knowing how hard it would be, and Daniel had said yes immediately. But I knew the truth was more complicated than that. We'd chosen each other multiple times, in our first marriage, in our divorce, in rebuilding our relationship, in remarrying. Each choice had been difficult in its own way. Each had required sacrifices and compromises and leaps of faith. But the question that haunted me wasn't whether we'd made the right choices. It was whether Emma would have been better off if I'd made different ones. If I told Daniel about the pregnancy from the beginning in this timeline, would he have stayed? Would we have worked through our problems and never divorced at all? Or would we have stayed together miserably? Teaching Emma that love meant settling for someone who made you unhappy? I'd never know. I'd made my choices and they'd led to this life. A life where Emma had a mother who'd been present from the beginning, a father who'd proven his commitment even if belatedly, and eventually a stable two-parent household. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Years passed. Emma graduated high school and went off to college. Alex grew from a quiet child into a talkative preteen. Daniel and I navigated empty nest syndrome when Emma left, only to have our nest suddenly much fuller when Alex entered his demanding middle school years. On our 10th wedding anniversary, 15 years after Daniel had first come back into our lives, we went back to the park where we'd had our first meeting with Emma. It was a beautiful spring day, the same kind of day it had been when 7-year-old Emma had met her father for the first time. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? Daniel asked, sitting on the same bench where he'd sat that day. All the time, I admitted. I think about the timeline where you left and never came back. I think about the timeline where we never separated at all. I think about all the different versions of our lives that might have existed. Do you think this is the best one? I think it's the one we've got, I said. And that's enough. Daniel took my hand. I'm glad I got a second chance with you. And a third chance, really, when you agreed to marry me again. I know I didn't deserve either of those chances, but I'm grateful you gave them to me anyway. You earned them, I said. You showed up and did the work and proved you'd changed. That's more than a lot of people do. Still, thank you. For forgiving me. For trusting me. For building this life with me. I squeezed his hand, looking out at the park where our family had truly begun. Thank you for coming back. For not giving up when I pushed you away. For loving Emma enough to fight for a relationship with her, even when I made it difficult. She's pretty great, isn't she? They both are. They really are. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching other families play in the park, seeing younger versions of ourselves in the parents chasing toddlers and negotiating with stubborn children. Maya, Daniel said eventually, there's something I've always wanted to ask you but I've been afraid to. What is it? That day when we separated, when you suggested we take time apart, you said you'd been thinking about whether our marriage was what you wanted. But we'd only been married 2 years. What made you suddenly start questioning things? This was the moment I'd been dreading for 15 years. The moment where Daniel asked a question I couldn't answer without revealing the impossible truth about my rebirth. About living through 2 timelines. About knowing his choices before he made them. I just knew, I said carefully. I could feel that you weren't happy, that you were thinking about leaving. So I gave you an out before you had to be the bad guy. You could feel it? Call it intuition. Call it paying attention. I knew you were going to leave, Daniel. I just didn't know when or why or for whom. So I made it easy for you. And you never told me you were pregnant because Because I knew you'd leave anyway. Because I didn't want you to stay out of obligation and resent me and our child for the rest of our lives. Because I thought Emma and I would be better off without you than with a father who didn't really want to be there. Were you right? Were you better off without me? I thought about my two lives, comparing them carefully. In the first timeline, Daniel's complete absence had hurt Emma, but she'd never known what she was missing. In this timeline, his temporary absence and eventual return had given Emma a father, but also complicated her childhood with custody arrangements and co-parenting conflicts. I don't know, I said honestly. Both paths had their challenges. But I think this path, the one where you came back and worked to be part of Emma's life, this path taught her something important. It taught her that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define you forever, that relationships can be repaired if both people are willing to do the work. Do you think she really believes that? Or do you think she still has abandonment issues from me not being there in her early years? Why don't you ask her? So we did. That night, we video called Emma at college and asked her a question we'd never quite had the courage to ask before. Emma, I said, your dad and I were talking today about our history, about how complicated your childhood was with us being divorced and then getting back together. We wanted to know how you really feel about all of that. About us. Emma was quiet for a moment on the screen. You want the honest truth? Always, Daniel said. Okay. Honestly, I used to be angry about it. When I was younger, maybe 10 or 11, I remember feeling angry that other kids had parents who'd been together their whole lives and I didn't. I remember feeling like I'd missed out on something important by not having both of you there from the beginning. We're so sorry, I started, but Emma held up a hand. Let me finish. I felt that way, but as I got older, I started to realize something. A lot of my friends with parents who stayed together, they watched their parents fight constantly or stay together despite being miserable. They learned that relationships meant settling or suffering. But I learned something different. I learned that relationships take work. That mistakes can be forgiven. That people can grow and change. And I learned that family is about showing up and doing the work, not about perfect origins. Daniel was crying now, not even trying to hide it. So you don't resent us? No, Dad. I don't resent you. I mean, I probably needed some therapy to work through my feelings about everything, but doesn't everyone? The point is, you guys figured it out. You did the work. You built something good even after everything fell apart. That's pretty impressive. After we hung up, Daniel and I held each other for a long time, both of us crying with relief and gratitude that Emma had somehow turned out okay despite all our mistakes. We got lucky, Daniel said. She could have ended up damaged and resentful. It wasn't luck, I said. It was us showing up, doing the work, proving to her that we were committed to being her parents even when it was hard. We earned having a well-adjusted kid. That night, lying in bed next to Daniel just like I had thousands of times over the past 15 years, I thought about my impossible journey one more time. I died at 45 in my first life, alone and full of regrets. I'd been given a second chance, a rebirth that let me rewrite my story. And I'd chosen a path that was messy and complicated and sometimes painful, but ultimately full of love. I didn't know if I'd made all the right choices. I didn't know if Emma would have been happier in some other version of events. I didn't know if Daniel and I would have eventually found our way back to each other if I'd chosen differently at key moments. There were infinite possibilities, infinite timelines, infinite ways our story could have unfolded. But this timeline, this messy, imperfect, beautiful timeline, was the one we'd created together through choices and mistakes and forgiveness and growth. And lying there in the dark, listening to Daniel breathe beside me, I realized something profound. I was happy. Genuinely, completely happy in a way I'd never been in my first life. Not because everything was perfect, but because I'd learned that perfection wasn't the goal. Connection was the goal. Love was the goal. Family was the goal. And we'd achieved all of that through persistence and patience and willingness to keep trying even when it seemed impossible. When I got pregnant 20 years ago in my first life, Daniel vanished with his first love for 20 years, and I died never having seen him again. But in this life, when I got pregnant and chose to delay telling him, I'd set in motion a chain of events that eventually led us back to each other in a healthier, stronger way. I couldn't say which timeline was better, but I could say with certainty that this timeline was mine, built from my choices, shaped by my experiences in both lives, and filled with people I loved who loved me back. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.